of her lecture is very intriguingly Ask a Knight, research questions around the archives of the Order of St. John. By a happy coincidence, I learned a few hours ago that today happens to be the birthday of Sir Hannibal Scicluna, who was such a pivotal figure in the Maltese archival scenario. So in a sense, it's a bit of a tribute to him as well, this lecture. So Valeria, thank you, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Buttigieg. Good evening, and thank you everyone for being here today. I would like to thank the Malta University Historical Society for this wonderful initiative. So sharing part of my research with you gives me the opportunity to retrace my steps on an archival pathway that for me was both a professional and a life experience, as well as an adventure, of course. There is an element of serendipity in the archives that does not only belong to the researcher's experience. When we are trained as professionals in the field, we usually associate the idea of order, organization, and hierarchical structure to the archive as a complex of records. But we are also taught that the bulk of documents is not only the result of the institutional and individual activities and memories, already intricate by definition, but also what remains of that archive after years, sometimes centuries of vicissitudes and interventions. There are too many factors to consider and to discuss. But what happens very often is that, especially approaching historical archival collections, archivists are required to juggle and sometimes struggle also with the three-dimensionality of human interactions and decisions, outdated rearrangements, gaps, displaced records, and layers of history. Even applying the strong theoretical knowledge, professional tools, and practical experience, serendipity plays out in many ways and leads us on unexpected pathways of research and life. Almost 9 years ago, when I walked in the reading room of the Magistral Archives of the Order of St. John in Rome for my master thesis, I just had a vague idea of what the order was and absolutely no clue of its archival memories. Besides the fascination of spending days, then it became years, in the ancient palace where the knights still live and an order still functions, I consider my experience there as a privileged opportunity to look at Malta and its archival collections from a different and unique perspective. Magistral Archives is still today an unexplored reality. The genesis of the Magistral Archives is quite complex and has only recently been investigated. Just to give you a general overview on the collection, a few records once belonging to Antonio Bosio, the agent of the order in Rome and famous Christian archaeologist who donated the palace to the knights in 1629 and also studied by a colleague and friend of mine, Chiara Cecalupo, that today is here with us, can be considered the first archival core of the Magistral Archives. From 1631, the Magistral Palace became the seat of the embassy of the order to the Holy See, a very important peripheral institution, considering especially the double nature of the order, religious and sovereign. Some of the resident ambassadors did not live there from 1631. But according to the Hospitaller statutes, each ambassador was obliged to deliver the documents produced during his mandate to his successor and send a copy to the chancery of the convent. It is not easy to establish how regularly this happened in practice, since the diplomatic records from the 16th century to the middle of the 17th century at Magistral Archives are quite fragmented and incomplete, probably also because the palace became only later the official seat of the embassy. But it has been possible to identify and reconstruct the archive of the embassy as an independent archival core, even if the archive of the Ricetta di Roma, the local financial office, and the archive of the Privy of Rome, one of the peripheral Hospitaller administrative offices, were preserved in the same place for all the modern age. But there is more. In 1834, the central convent of the order moved to the Magistral Palace in Rome along with its archives. These were the documents that had been generated during the temporary stay of the order in Sicily after the loss of Malta from 1800 circa 1826, and then in Ferrara from 1826 to 1834, at which point the order moved to Rome. As we will see in a minute, these fragmented records, still largely unexplored, offer an amazing and unique perspective not only on the order after Malta, but also and especially on how the order was before 1798 and the role of its records, and still vivid in memory, for the reconstruction of a new convent. Later, during the 19th and the 20th century, the accumulation of ancient documents at the Magistral Archives of Rome, for different reasons, made the archival knots even more difficult to unravel. Sadly, a lot of rearrangements according to outdated criteria took place and led to the fragmentation of the original archives and the merging of records of different provenance together. This unfortunate state of events lasts until 2013, a time when the memory of these institutions and the related archives was completely lost, and this fragmentary collection was uniquely identified as Archivio Gerosolimitano, at a singular, with no clue of the different provenance and nature of the material. A new reconstruction and identification was needed. But how to move in this labyrinthic pathway with the proper archival tools? It is a different story, which also include that element of serendipity that I mentioned before. Opening box by box and discovering unexpected records as its major influence on the research pathway. The periodical discoveries of some old finding aids, like inventories, indexes, and repertories, brought new light on old forgotten memories and helped to figure out provenance and original orders of the records, and to start a long-term research and comparison with the Hospitaller central documents in Malta. Adopting the center-periphery relationship as a macro guiding principle, including the issues and challenges of defining what is the center and the periphery in such an impressive network of political and social relations, was and still is an essential approach, in my opinion, to understand the Hospitaller and archival institutional dynamics and to navigate an astounding hierarchical structure and extensive capillary organization. These last years of exploratory research and first virtual rearrangements provided a solid but general understanding of the Magistral Archives context and its former organization, but only revealed some fragments of their information potentials, and most of all, intriguing research questions that still climb a response. Today, I will share with you two of the main research issues generated from my first encounter with the Hospitaller records, and that require to be explored from different perspectives. This is how my journey began. First of all, how has the institutional profile of the Order of St. John changed through the centuries? As a millenary institution, we can observe transformations, fractures, continuities, and adaptations. At the same time, studying rules, laws, regulations, and in the long term, as well as comparing the order in a broader historical and institutional context, allow just a general understanding of its features. The search for a periodical redefinition of its identity was always naturally influenced by internal and external factors, and it was an ongoing process. Although the events in the 18th century, as we know, lead to a strong institutional fracture for the Knights, this process did not end in 1798. What helped me most to understand the order during the early modern age was studying the events and the custodial history of its records, the story of the records, after 1798. After the loss of Malta, a new balance between a long tradition and the new European scenario was needed for those few surviving knights. The redefinition of the ideal Hospitaller knight and the admission of new novices were the lifeblood to reconstruct the order from its ashes. Now, how to investigate the ideal profile of the Hospitaller knight? An unpublished early 19th century memoir offers a glimpse into the convent, outlines the portrait of the early modern knight before the loss of Malta, and tries to build the profile of the 19th century Hospitaller, the new one. In illustrating the ideal cursus honorum of a knight, the anonymous writer points out that to become an high-ranking Hospitaller, a deep knowledge of the order, as it was, is essential, especially for those who live outside the convent and cannot be fond of an institution which they do not know and understand, especially having no clue of what happened before the loss of Malta. The young ones. A full recovery of the order's constitutional nature, history, and memory was urgently needed. It is through the correspondence of the convent preserved at magistral archives in Rome and the few Hospitallers who are actively participating in giving new life to the order that one can delve into the activities behind the scenes and retrace the order's steps in Malta. The admission process, the lot-bearing, archival, and institutional Hospitaller procedure needs to be completely re-explored according to the early modern constitutions. Admissions could have played again, after Malta, a primary role to raise consciousness and interest in the Hospitaller dimension, starting from the Eternal City. I would like to share with you a meaningful quote from an anonymous letter addressed from Rome to the Vice Chancellor of the convent in Sicily, Amabile Vella, at the beginning of the 19th century. Yesterday morning at the Palace of the Religion, the Knight Filippo Ciccolini professed his votes, and the celebration was uplifting. I thought of inviting all the knights, even the Knights of Devotion, to make the ceremony more important. This event had a positive impact, and in Rome, the sleeping memory of the order woke up again. Now, reports, letters, memoir like this of the early 19th century show how the newly formed convent, led by powerful figures like Antonio Miari and Amabile Vella, undertook research on statutes, regulations, and records to reconstruct and reinvigorate the understanding of the early modern order and its constitutional structure. What is interesting is that since the central records of the order remained on the island, the knights relied mostly on peripheral sources, like the archives of the priories and commanderies, today completely dismembered, and in some circumstances, asked for the help of the few members of the order, mostly chaplains, still in Malta. Among them, who played a vital role was Gaetano Bruno, as we know. And he not only saved the central archives from the French, working as a bridge between the old and the new government, but also maintained an ongoing correspondence with the knights in Sicily after 1798. And this is something unknown. During the early British domination in 1800, Bruno was also appointed archivist and custodian of the records of the order in Malta. According to the instructions of Governor Alexander Ball, he managed not only to identify, collect altogether, and rearrange the surviving fragments of the archives scattered in different buildings and institutions in Malta, but also recovered many invaluable records from the antique market. He saved the core identity of the order and supported at distance the ordered study and reconstruction of the constitutional and legal nature according to the early modern tradition. The early modern period in Malta, which is the main but not the only focus of my research, marked again an age of great change for the order. Between stability and instability, the order, challenged by the ever-changing political scenario, transformed its institutional boundaries influenced by the friction between the religious and the secular world. From what I could understand from this ongoing research, there is always one element which provided stability and continuity in this long-term transformation: the progressive consolidation of the order's archival procedures and the preservation of its archival memory. Further to the obvious need of running the institution, defending privileges, and fulfilling administrative duties, the archives played an essential role in the periodical search and redefinition of the identity of the order. And the archives also worked for the Knights as a safe place to seek refuge, even when there was not a physical place to host the convent, before and after Malta. So here we are with the second research question. How can we reconstruct the order's archival history and procedures? And how can we investigate the record-keeping systems, relationships, and communications between central and peripheral offices? There has been a strong focus on the military, social, and cultural history of the Order of St. John, with excellent results. By contrast, the history of its archives, the institutional dynamics between center and periphery, and the workings of the different officia running the central convent and the priories, especially for the early modern age, are still a little known story. The 19th and the early 20th century scholars who conducted the first difficult and intensive investigations of the archives of the Order of St. John paved the way for the modern hospitaller studies. Their work provided future scholars with an important range of sources to study, based, of course, on their observations and now outdated methodology. Despite their efforts, much remains unknown about the administration of the order. The archival fractures, change of seats, dismemberment, and merging of the order's archival collections inside and outside of Malta are still overshadowed areas of research. This lack of knowledge and the dispersion of these records jeopardize our understanding of offices, functions, and archival practices of the order's institutions. As rapidly discussed on other occasions, our starting point to tackle this issue today is dealing with a completely different archival scenario in Malta as well as in Europe. This raises new questions on the dynamics, which influence the fate of these records after their massive dispersion at the end of the 18th century, the suppression of religious orders in Europe, the collective mania, and layers of human intervention through more than 2 centuries. We need to consider that central and peripheral records of the order in Malta and Europe are today preserved in hundreds of holding institutions, private and public archives, libraries, and museums, many of them undiscovered and not accessible, and falling, of course, within different countries and legal frameworks. At the end of the 19th century, again, a team of brave scholars led by the well-known archivist and paleographer Joseph de la Villeroux, a sort of legend for us, attempt to map and transcribe part of the hospitaller records date up to the beginning of the 14th century and scattered in different European countries. The words of de la Villeroux in the introduction of his massive work, the Cartulaire, are quite evocative. Now, I quote, "In the midst of so many vicissitudes, it is not without relevance to inquire about the fate of the archives of the hospital. Indeed, the documents are scattered in various institutions all over Europe. Sometimes they are found as small isolated groups, or occasionally found in a considerable number in the same archive. Some fonts, on the other hand, escaped even the most careful investigation and seem to be completely lost." These are his words in 1890. So properly identifying today, exploring and understanding the records of the order require us to move in 2 main different directions. On one hand, a systematic investigation of the establishment, rules, procedures, use, and management of the archives, especially taking into account the peculiarities of the different offices, is essential. On the other hand, the custodial history of the records can only be retraced through the analysis of the individual holding institutions, regulations, and preservation patterns to understand how and when those records accumulated in that shape and in that particular repository. As part of this ongoing research, I decided to adopt the following strategies. First of all, the discovery, identification, and first analysis of the surviving old finding gates of the order is currently offering an interesting testing ground to explore the order's archival tapestry and unravel one of the most complex challenges, at least for the archivist, the document's provenance and the record-keeping systems. For example, one of the recent rediscoveries, an 18th century inventory of the chancery of the order, allowed the identification of some series of records completely artificially rearranged during the British period, differently from their original order. Secondly, through the comparison between the rule and the practice and the analysis of the gap between them, the study and reconstruction of the admission process as one of the most important archival procedures opened new unexpected research pathways and lead to the rediscovery of the forgotten functions of one of the hospitalers institutions. Thirdly, a larger testing ground and comparative approach beyond the archival material at magistral archives and the National Library of Malta was also needed. Having adopted the Langue of Italy as a case study between center and periphery, the creation of a 3 years census and first map of the hospitaller records preserved in the Italian state archives not only confirmed the state of disruption of the original hospitaller documents, but also revealed chancery practices and new chancery practices and different records-keeping procedures, which were difficult to identify before. The fragmentation of these archives should not discourage us as scholars, but embolden us to reconstruct what once was an advanced information and records-keeping system developed over centuries of practice and tradition. My intention today was just to briefly share some of these key issues with the aim of stimulating curiosity and discussion about the huge and intricate hospitaller archival tapestry, lost memories, and also forgotten aspects of its history. But the goal was also to share something more. And this is how I would like to conclude. As Pierre Assoulin, a journalist and a writer, stated in one of his books, the pleasure of research is inseparable from the vertigo that generates it. Beside all the open research questions that I mentioned today, what I really wanted to share with you is a taste of that vertigo. The vertigo that I felt the first time I opened a volume sitting in the reading room of Magistral Archives, and that I feel every time that I walk in the National Library of Malta, eager to explore a new forgotten hospitaller archival pathway. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Valeria. That was a wonderful, concise overview of the subject. I should add that this is something of a teaser in the sense that at the end of April, the 28th or the 29th, we will be having a live in-person lecture by Dr. Valeria Vanesio. She will be our Andrew Vella Memorial Lecture speaker this year. And on that occasion, she will be exploring in further detail some of the themes that she has touched upon today. But we will announce more details about that in due course.